Welcome to the Community Development Podcast, a podcast dedicated to community development practice and approaches, sharing our learning and connecting the workforce. My name is Russell. Welcome to the first podcast of 2020. In a moment we are going to be joined by Mark McFeeters, a lecturer in community youth work at Ulster University in Northern Ireland, and by one of his final year undergraduates, Lauren McAreavey. Just wait for them to get settled in at the Jordanstown campus to the north of Belfast. In the meantime, just by way of recap of what we got up to at the end of 2019, podcast 21 was with Pippa Coots from Carnegie UK Trust in Stirling, where we got together to talk about the Turnaround Towns paper that they'd not long published at that point, that looks very much at kind of how towns, and it is specifically towns, can revive fortunes, can create new narratives for themselves. But quite specifically, we talked about the role of the community sector, the role specifically of independent, of autonomous, development trust type organisations, those creative, vibrant but locally owned organisations, community anchors I tend to call them, also known as hubs, the critical role they have in turning around some of the fortunes of those towns. Before that, was really grateful for the invitation to the Oh What a Year celebration event with Eden Communities Wales at the Big Moose Coffee in Cardiff City Centre, where they were just looking back through the course of the year as to what different very grassroots community activity and endeavour had achieved throughout the year, based in and on the outskirts of Cardiff. And I was joined by a couple of those speakers who talked a little bit about their work as well. So yeah, looking forward to catching up with Mark and Lauren. It'll be great to have another view from Northern Ireland. Podcast 19, I had a really fascinating conversation with Johnny Curry talking about his community development practice in East Belfast, and I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more from what's going on over there. Although that said, Mark is talking a little bit more generically about youth work and it as a discipline, as still as a relatively young profession. And what's going to be fascinating is hearing from Lauren about where she is at, immersed in that learning, not long having finished placements. Really looking forward to seeing what the different perspectives are. So yeah, hello, Mark.
Hello, Russell. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. How is Jordanstown this morning?
So Jordanstown, we're about 5 or 6 miles outside of Belfast, and it's cold, wet, windy. We're right along the shore, Belfast Lough, so it's pretty blustery, pretty cold, but the sun is just coming out, so I feel a wee bit like summer, but it's pretty icy. You're
indoors on university campus, so we're not doing this in some sort of youth work outreach context on a drafty street corner.
We're relatively lucky. We've no heat in this room for some reason, although we do have some nice plants and stuff so it's glamorous.
The main thing is the fire test. The fire alarm test has been and gone, so we're hoping not to get interrupted with that.
As long as a class doesn't come into this room, we'll be okay.
What is it you do at the University of Ulster then, Mark?
Yeah, so I'm a lecturer in community youth work. We have a BSc honours degree in community youth work, which runs in a couple of different versions, but I'm involved in the full-time route. So it's a 3-year full-time degree, and my role is looking after first-year full-time students in the main, and secondary to that then I look after placements across the levels. So our students will complete a block placement on every year of their course on the full-time version. So I look after the placement and coordination of placements and liaison with the sector and helping students identify placements. I mean, in terms of some of the context, we also have a part-time version of the course that runs over 4 years, where students are in a concurrent placement throughout their training. They're here 1 day a week for study time, but it's a different route, and we have a colleague who looks after that. We also then run a top postgrad programme in the Northwest in Londonderry at our McGee campus. And again, that's a 2-year postgraduate programme with an additional year for a master's. So a range of our suite of programmes, I suppose, across the university, but I kind of slot in with the full-time BSc honours programme.
And that's kind of important as well, isn't it? The fact that it's a university with lots of campuses and connections with communities.
Yeah, so we were the University of Ulster, but in the last couple of years we've just changed to become Ulster University. That makes a big difference. But so Jordanstown, the location I'm at, Jordanstown, is, as I said, about 5 or 6 miles north of Belfast, just right on the Lough shore of Belfast Lough. We're due to move to Belfast City Centre within the next couple of years. The new building is currently being finished off, and on the northern part of the city centre. But we have campuses in Coleraine. We have another which is kind of northeast of Northern Ireland, And then we have a campus in Magee, which is our Londonderry site. And I mean, our course itself has always been historically a split campus course between ourselves at Jordanstown and Magee. So in the past, Magee, for example, has run a part-time BSc honours degree when a postgrad has been at Jordanstown. But at the minute, our focus on Magee is particularly around level 4 pre-vocational training, continuing professional development programs, and then our postgrad and master's programs, whereas Jordanstown, our focus is around undergrad training, both part-time and full-time. So yeah, we're a team of 7 people. 6 of us are based almost full-time here at Jordanstown, and then we have one colleague who's full-time up in the northwest of Magee.
And the relevance of all this is because we're going to be talking about youth work, and that's a first for the podcast. I think we have touched on it on a couple of occasions, but really very, very little in depth in the previous episodes. Another first then is also the involvement of a student who's immersed in that learning process, doing that studying, doing the placements, not long finished one. So welcome to the podcast, Lauren.
Thanks, I'm really excited for it.
So your final year, yeah? How's it going?
Yeah, it's great, in the depths of it now. So finishing my final placement, and then I have a critical thinking module and onto what is essentially a dissertation. It's our study of applied practice.
Dreaded dissertation. I did joint honours for my degree, and so I didn't have to do one, which I can remember quite fondly. While everybody else all my single honours friends were trying to meet the deadline with a few sort of hours to spare. I'm sure. But you said you just off there before we started, you've not long finished a placement. Where was that?
It was with the Northern Ireland Youth Forum, so they're a regional youth organisation based in Belfast. They work across the north, working with young people of all ages and promoting the voice of young people. Which is needed
at that level, but I guess it's also needed at community levels increasingly.
Massively, yeah. We're actually working in communities, but then today our director's up in Stormont and promoting a youth assembly and how that's needed as well. And there's different platforms that we need to be providing for young people to have their voice heard.
It was episode 19 that, as I touched on a bit earlier, that Johnny Curry and I were chatting about his practice, and he was obviously talking about his work and talking about what he does sort of very much in situ in East Belfast, where he's based. And we're not going to be talking about youth work in Northern Ireland per se, but looking at it a bit more generally as a discipline. But I guess place matters, and it informs what we do and how we understand community and things like that. So we're going to touch on that. But I think, Mark, you got wind that Johnny and I had this chat. Johnny obviously sort of shared the link to the podcast via his own sort of networks. And we had a sort of a chat, and we actually thought something that just is reflective, but also just puts out there very, very simply, what is youth work? Because presumably it's not just anything or anyone who has contact with young people. Are teachers doing youth work? Are scout or guide leaders doing youth work? Are there particular approaches, particular sort of values and principles that underpin it that therefore defines it as youth work and therefore distinct from other, like I said, other contacts then with young people?
Good question. I mean, you're touching on some of our modules, some of our essays there, I suppose. Obviously, in terms of the focus, the primary focus in youth work is on young people. And so whenever we're talking youth work, we're talking primarily around an age-specific piece of work, which is different, I suppose, to children, different to adults, but looking particularly at young people. I suppose in terms of the purpose of community youth work, as we understand it, it's particularly promoting education, welfare, rights of young people in particular. So that comes in various forms in terms of practice, but effectively what we're looking at is, how do we help young people grow and develop? How do we help them influence the settings in which they live and make change and have a voice, as Lauren was highlighting with her placement there, as well as thinking about inclusion, equity. And I suppose in terms of some of the process, I mean, the real focus is around the informal, educative focus, that youth work is distinctly educational in its approach and its process. And that's where I would differentiate between, as you say, somebody hanging out with young people and doing activities with young people versus somebody who is a professionally trained youth worker working in a distinctly youth work way, broadly speaking.
I think Mark's pretty much covered. There's an essay we have in first year, it's what is youth work, and I'm sitting there like, oh my god, where do you even begin? So I took the route of what is youth work in relation to conversation, and I think that's a key feature of our method, even our methodologies, in terms of just starting with a conversation with a young person and not go into maybe our targets as maybe a teacher would have to, or their curriculum, and just starting where the young person's at. And I think that's very key to the work that we do.
No, I think that's helpful actually for someone who's coming at this, completely uninitiated, because I've been part of any number of community conversations, community audits, community planning exercises at a very, at a very kind of neighbourhood community level. One of the things I think probably has been said every single time, or certainly most of the time, is, we need more for young people. We need more for children. And it is hard to, indeed, I think it's wrong to kind of sort of criticise that or be opposed to that. I think that's inherently a good thing. But I came to understand eventually, and it wasn't an immediate thing. It was from spending time with youth workers. And I have no, cards on the table. I have no work qualifications or much by way of experience. But it became clear to me from spending time with those youth workers that actually you need to probe that, something for the kids, in inverted commas. You need to probe that a bit more, and you need to break that down, because it's not just providing swings and a roundabout. It's not just opening the community centre, another night just for them and getting a pool table. That process of something else going on that's a bit more meaningful, it's a bit more, like you say, reflective, educational, I think was the word specifically we used, is distinct from just, upgrading the local park. Which is not to say that youth workers don't have a role in that process, perhaps, and certainly facilitating young people's voice in how that park is upgraded, but it's quite distinct from other things. I'm not sure I was appreciative of that when I first started doing community work, looking back.
Yeah, no, and it's funny, we even just talked before, I'm thinking back whenever I started as well, before I was trained and got a post working as a youth worker. I really had no idea what I was doing, and you quickly, looking back, you're right, you think, some things I was doing in the early days, whereas I had no idea, you guys, that was really good practice, really good youth work. I didn't know it at the time.
Yeah.
But I suppose it's linking to that, wasn't the purpose and intentionality around what you're there for. So, in the same vein that having a pool table or, whatever the activity is with a young person isn't a youth work methodology, but then it's the purpose and intention of the person who is with that young person. What is their presence? What's their role? What's their agenda, I suppose, in that relationship? I think, as Lauren touched on, I think that conversation piece is critical in terms of, it's, and that then leads to some of the critique around what youth work's about, because as you said there, Russell, there's no doubt that there's teachers, social workers, counsellors who are really good youth workers, although they wouldn't describe themselves that, but they have this critical point of there's something about maybe the conversation or the nature of the relationship that is really good youth work, and so we try to bring those things together to articulate this is actually what professional practice is about, and I suppose that's important to recognise as well, that whilst the youth work label might not be on somebody, there's some teachers, for example, I'm thinking of my own life, who are really good youth workers, but are housed within a slightly different environment as well.
Yeah. So, Lauren, are you thinking of these things? So when you're on your placements or have been on your placements, are these the things going through your mind? Are you seeing the kind of the theory, the classroom, the time you spent in the classroom with, with the likes of Mark and colleagues talking about this stuff? Are you beginning to sort of see that then when you're out on your placements?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a process in which that we do a reflective recording on placement. So it's just an opportunity for us to reflect on our learning and add a bit of theory to that. And through that process, that definitely helped me understand the formal side of it, but then the hands-on side of practice and engaging with young people. But even just that simple transference from seeing it happen and hearing it about it, it's very clear, like the models even and how they implement in real life. You just kind of click with these things, and you're like, oh, that makes sense now. There's actually a formal way of this being done, but I'm doing it already in my processes. It's just sometimes natural as well. Are
you able to give like an illustration or a flavour of what that reflective process might sort of cover? Because I think it's helpful if someone's listening to this and is still thinking, yeah, but it's just kind of adults kind of hanging out with young people, as hopefully we are and will continue to demonstrate, it is a bit more meaningful and a bit deeper than that. And there is, like you said, there's models, there are approaches and values underpinning it all and principles. So what does that reflective process possibly kind of look like, possibly cover?
For me, I would be quite reflective, and I enjoy just learning from experience. After a session, we would debrief, and that's evaluating the session. But even in terms of my own learning, it's maybe having a one-to-one and maybe filling out a form and really thinking through, right, what was my thoughts and feelings in that? How did that impact on the young person? How was the young person in that situation? it's thinking through every factor nearly and unpacking that for yourself and really just zoning in on thoughts, feelings, emotions, and the impact of that.
So is it possible and is it conceivable that reflection might take place after something that's fairly unstructured, open access, whoever might kind of rock up tonight, or it could be something that's a little bit more planned with a bit more intent around covering aspects? I don't know, it could be careers, it could be aspirations, it could be tackling particular issues, bullying or something like that.
Yeah, totally. So if I'm running a program, I would reflect after the session just for my own learning, and then to reflect on the effectiveness of it in terms of what did the group take away, how was it in terms of my planning for the session, how did that execute. But then in terms of a drop-in, I would reflect on what was the atmosphere like tonight, what kind of conversations did I have with the young people, what were their emotions. So did anyone come in that was maybe creating issues, maybe what's going on for them. It's really unpacking the situation, whether it is planned or maybe it's totally a drop-in kind of session in terms of young people dropping in and out and just hanging around with their friends.
Yeah, I think what's interesting as well is we did a podcast a while back around this term of co-production and looked at it not in a necessarily traditional community development sense, or certainly not in any kind of neighbourhood or estate sort of context, but with a heritage organisation affiliated to the University of Huddersfield in the north of England, and it was around collecting, collating, preserving kind of memories to do with rugby league. And of course the supporters were a community of interest. They had this kind of real long, tight, very passionate connection with that particular sport. And Dave Smith at the Heritage Institution was talking about how, look, you know, I'm the, I think he called himself the professional idiot and they're the amateur experts. Because he knows nothing about that particular sport, but what they were trying to do was co-produce something that's meaningful to these people. So that was the context to explore in that. So it was quite removed from maybe the context that us three are familiar with. There's still those bonds and those connections between people based around, in that context, a particular sport. And this issue of co-production, the more I've kind of heard about it, I think, do you know what, into my experience, not all, I'll hasten to add, but a lot of youth workers have been co-producing things with young people for quite some time. Yeah. Yet it tends to get presented as this, you know, rather kind of buzz, new, trendy type approach. I wonder whether it is in the youth work context.
One of the core values, I suppose, that we talk about in the early days in this course, around that idea of association, which really links to what you're saying, also in terms of, you know, it's a fundamental part of the way we work is with young people rather than youth work being something that happens to young people, you know, and that idea that, you know, association, we talk about participation being more than just a young person being in a youth centre, as Lauren's described. It's actually about how we help young people have power and control over decisions, and that could range from what colour do you want the walls in the youth centre to how do you politicise young people and do something a bit more proactive in Lauren's context in terms of placement. So I suppose I would agree, you know, we train students here to think much more about our role with young people is that it's not about us, although we're the professionals as such, in inverted commas. It's actually a young person-centric way of working, that actually this is about the needs of the young people in front of us. How do we help them on their own journey, to be cliche about it, to realise their potential, to move forward one step or 10 steps, whatever it might be, and how do we help them, you know, as you say, make things, do things that's actually with people, whether that's peers or professionally trained youth workers, rather than how do we do things for young people and then create opportunities for them to go and do things, because that in the long run doesn't actually work. And so that gets back to some of that Freirean methodology or view in terms of emancipation and helping young people have their own voice and their own stake in the system as such, like, you know, so that's very much part of, you know, the fundamentals of our profession, I suppose.
Yeah. Are you enjoying it, Lauren?
Yeah, I really love it, and participation's aspect of working with young people that I am very passionate about. I think through my own experiences as a young person, I kind of seen value in, I need that opportunity. So now I'm looking to create platforms and allow young people that opportunity also.
Yeah. To what extent, Mark, has that language changed? I mean, is there a bit of a journey taking place here over the last, 20 years, or and that might well be more locally to yourselves in Northern Ireland, it might be elsewhere in UK and Ireland, or maybe even further afield?
Yeah, definitely it's changing, or has been changing, I suppose. You know, tracking our history, I suppose, you know, a reasonably young profession as such, you know, kind of, you know, late 60s, early 70s in terms of professionally endorsed training. The course here started early 1970s, not long after the Troubles kicked off. And I suppose, so we're still quite young. And I suppose with that being said, youth work, regardless of the context, is contested in terms of its place as a profession. What does it mean? All that kind of stuff. So we're always fighting that battle of trying to articulate who we are, what we do, and why that is unique or distinct or of any value, I suppose. And I suppose what I was saying about the last maybe 10, 15 years, government policy, funding, austerity, etc., etc. There's this big, the big agenda around management and control starts to predicate any practice delivery, because you're fighting that upward battle of whether it's safeguarding restrictions or protocols. You're also fighting with funding demands and requirements, and we've all got to play the game to some extent, but that does start to dilute the ethos and vision of what youth work was designed to be. But I suppose particularly around some of those basic yet very profound elements around, as Lauren said, conversation and relationship building, being with young people, association, participation. Those are the things that start to struggle, because they're the things that they don't get lost, but they get diluted in the sense that a practitioner would then struggle to identify this is a key part of what youth work is about, rather than I've been to a university course and I am better hanging out with young people. I suppose that's important. Our very first modules in the course is about getting back to, okay, what is youth work really about? What are we talking about here? Not in terms of telling me your experience and what you think it's about. It's actually, let's go back to what is this really about? And is what you're doing really youth work, or is there a critique to be had there as well? So I suppose, yes, the language definitely is changing, particularly in terms of funding and money and budgets. The language changes to, as Lauren's already alluded to, in terms of outcomes and evidence. That starts to become a much bigger feature of all of our professions, and with some regard in terms of demonstrating value for money and competing for funding. That starts to change the whole environment. And the Northern Irish context itself is, as you say, youth work is the same in terms of values and underpinning professional standards across the UK and Ireland. But in terms of the Northern Irish context, it has changed, because we're in a peaceful society now. I suppose we're post Good Friday Agreement, which, things have changed, thankfully, but there's some things that haven't changed all that much. And I suppose it's recognising that, yes, we've moved on and things have changed in terms of our focus. Words like community relations have changed to words around good relations. There's citizenship is a big feature of our practice now, rather than dealing with social injustice. The language around how funders would describe things and how policy would describe things has changed. Well, I suppose some of the issues are the same as they have been, and I suppose that's interesting.
That certainly echoes what Johnny was sort of talking about, and not to, certainly in no way, and it's not my place to gloss over anything related to the Troubles and that period, but, when he's talking about processes of deindustrialisation affecting parts of Belfast, for argument's sake, and certainly I'm familiar with it in South Wales, that doesn't tend to follow lines of religion or faith or community boundaries to any great extent. That can lay swathe to kind of whole communities, that process. And I think certainly for me, looking at it as a very much an outsider, there's something in that kind of those conversations, which I think is an incredibly powerful word, but it's one that we use quite a lot without necessarily realising its potential power. That word conversation, I think, is key, because if we were to have more conversations about those processes, how the capitalist system works, how the economy works, what is, neoliberalism and all those sorts of things, we begin to realise that actually there is a little bit more ties that bind us than we may perhaps want even to appreciate, let alone do appreciate. And I thought, to be fair to John, he kind of articulated some of those things really, really well. But at the same time, he was talking about how he has to modify some of the language he uses. So whereas one of the early podcasts that we did with a guy, Steve Smith, based up in Leeds, he was writing a book about community work, and he says, I come at this from a rights-based approach, and it is non-negotiable. That is it. You get me, you get that. You get that, you get me. And Johnny was sort of talking about how, I agree. I have to modify the language, because the word rights has certain, for want of a better word, baggage than in some of the communities he works in. And I thought that was fascinating, because language does matter, and these terms they can often be contested. I always find interesting these concepts of these words of things like poverty, austerity, inequality. What do those words mean, or what influence over the meaning of those words do people in communities have who are at the receiving end, as it were, of those things? You refer to power, Mark. You take power back. You reclaim some sense of ownership of some of this language and these terminologies to say, actually, I remember reading a fantastic visual exercise. I forget the charity it was. I think it was a housing charity maybe, and it was in the Wales Millennium Centre, big kind of brand new flashy kind of opera arts house. and it was talking about credit crunch. It was late 2000s, just as the recession was about to start. And there was a phrase in there, a quotation that someone said, I hear a lot about credit crunch. My entire life has been a credit crunch. This sense that actually meaning of certain terms and terminologies and wording permeates policy, government, media. It's how counsellors use them in a local community. Other people don't get the chance to say what those words mean to them or the impact of those. And I guess maybe, for certain parts of the community, young people, I would guess, are one of them, they get even less chance to articulate their voice around these things. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the things we would often critique students for saying this, and I'm going to use it myself, but we'd often talk about, our students would often say, I'm working with young people where they're at. Now, we kind of know what they mean in the sense that it's from the starting point, but it's about recognising that, us as youth workers, and I'm thinking back to whenever I was a practitioner on the ground myself, you're never coming into a community with the answers, and young people follow us and we will lead you to the way of the promised land as such. That you're trying to recognise that actually there's things that a community, as you say, is bound by, and historically and culturally, that you've got to recognise in order to do your work with and for those in the community. So it's recognising that whether you're a grassroots youth worker working in a drop-in centre environment, or if you're in the youth forum or a regional voluntary organisation with a wider remit, or if you're at the university delivering a training programme, you're always thinking about, is this serving the needs of those young people in our communities at grassroots level? Because whether it's an issue around, history from, the Troubles, whether it's to do with mental health or isolation or relationships, etc., it's always about recognising what is best for this group of people at this time, and how do we help aid their process or journey to, as taking control over that, what they can, I suppose. But as you say, there's young people who won't recognise in some ways what is at their hand in terms of being able to take power control over something, or what they have a stake in, how they can contribute. I suppose that's another part of what a youth worker's role is raise the horizons, to realise that there's more that you can consider as opportunities or options, and that's again part of what the likes of Lauren would be doing with our work on placement and in practice as well. It's championing to do that.
Between you and me, Lauren, feel free to get your own back, and you can get him to critique any of the terms he's using.
I'm just glad Lauren's saying the right answers. I'm learning a few things here as well.
Quality teaching, I'm sure. Quality teaching. Again, playing devil's advocate a little bit. He said he's more. No, there's a bit more to it than that. I used to find every now and again I'd have this kind of crisis of confidence, and I'm not so front-facing, immersed, community-based as I have been in the past. These days, I'll concede. But that thing that I know a little bit about a lot, but I don't know a lot about one or two particular things. And, you get to know a little bit about the planning process. You got to know about funding and grants. You might get to know a lot more about that, I suppose. You get to know a little bit about environmental issues. You get a little bit of insight into youth work because you rub shoulders with youth workers and things. To what extent are youth workers a jack of all trades but master of none? So they know a little bit about education and school environments. They know a little bit about maybe services related to sort of sexual health. They know a little bit about sport and games, but maybe sort of very rarely ever more than that. Is that something that happens, or people kind of worry about? Because it used to worry me.
It's definitely a worry. Young people face all sorts of problems, and we can't be the person to fix it all. I think that's important, and we would refer to it as a rescuer, and that's not our role as well. And I think that we forget that as practitioners, and sometimes we run to try and fix everything. But it's about signposting as well, and I think that's a key aspect of our work in terms of knowing people and being able to reach out to other people and look for help, and to be like, can you come in and talk to my group? They're maybe looking to find out more about this or that. But I think we try and make ourselves at least aware and a wee bit of informed, at least around different aspects, so that we can at least know people in other areas that we can touch on. I think everyone has their own areas that they know a bit more on, and I think that's great, because then you can be that person to be called upon also.
So and to what extent are youth workers, this is a very general question, but to what extent are youth workers afforded the time to develop relationships then with some of those other partners, stakeholders, organisations, services, etc.? Because like you said, Mark, earlier, that pressure for value for money, I found it with aspects of delivery within a community development, Communities First, a specific Welsh Government programme context, that it was all about delivery. Focus on delivery, as if, if you're not actually physically in a room with somebody in a broad community sense, that you're not providing value for money. Yet it's all in good sort of saying, I need to, my role is to signpost, but you need to have You need to know, to whom and where, and actually there could be 3 or 4 options, and you've got to identify which is the perhaps most appropriate or the best quality one or whatever. So to what extent are you afforded that time, or should you be afforded the time to do that?
I think that's a process of kind of growing in the sector as an individual and working with different organisations and partnership work. Like maybe you're working in a team, so different people have different people they can touch on, and you can network in that kind of. But it's also maybe going to consultations about funding, so then you can meet people who are going through the same processes as you and making them contacts as well. I think it's about you as an individual, but it's also your organisation you're working for in terms of putting you forward for them opportunities and investing in you as a worker as well.
It's funny because I do think that one of the quirks with our Northern Irish context is really, well, we're not pretty small, we're really small, so therefore it's quite a tight-knit wee community in terms of, you tend to know what's out there, what's and whether it's right or wrong. You tend to have a sense of what's a good place to refer somebody to or not refer them to. Those kind of things. That's maybe not unfair, but I suppose it's funny. As Lauren was talking, I was thinking back to whenever I was a youth worker, which isn't all that long ago. Part of the way we deliver the course, one of the modules. In fact, every module, one module in particular, deals with self-awareness. So a worker trying to grapple with who am I, what are the things that I really grapple with, and how do I understand how I relate to other people. And I suppose one of the things I would say of my own practice is that there are times whenever, because you're the person with a relationship with a young person, and in some ways there's a sense of dependency there, that you then as a worker, whether you want to or not, tend to have a sense of superhero persona about you, where you feel like I want to be the person to solve your problem. That's the way we need to change people's thinking around, is actually thinking much more about the young person and focusing that away from the worker, and being okay with letting somebody else work with that person, because actually it's about the young person again. That thinking back to that journey and thinking about we talk here again about, rather than having a deficit model of a young person with a problem to be fixed, it's more about a strengths-based approach and looking at the repertoire of characteristics and skills and qualities they have that can be utilised to help them move forward, rather than I have this issue, okay, let's fix that problem. Again, that's where we as a profession get ourselves in problems, because you just go from fixing, we're putting fires out left, right and centre, and that doesn't actually change society. It actually just prolongs some of the pain or the hurt or the issues going on still.
And I think there's a very, very clear parallel with the community development working in a bit more of a generic sense then, I suppose. Rejecting that deficit model, building on strengths, building on those assets, identifying those assets, maybe almost to a certain extent, almost re-narrating certain aspects of community to recognise that this is an asset or potentially an asset, and then building it from there. So I think there's definitely a parallel there. You've got this really interesting website called Critical Voice. Tell me a bit more about that, because I'm not aware of much similar in my networks and locality here.
So Critical Voice NI started, jeepers, I should know this, but I'm sure it's at least 6 years ago, give or take. My colleagues will laugh at me for not knowing that. But yeah, it's a pretty simple, simplistic website. The idea really was, it's a partnership between ourselves at Ulster University and Youth Action Northern Ireland, who are a regional voluntary youth organisation, with the premise of trying to help youth workers articulate their practice, whether that be via writing a short blog style reflective piece on a piece of work that we're delivering, to a longer, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 word article that's not in an academic published quality piece of writing, but it's again trying to raise the level of the sector to articulate some of the process and some of the things we were finding in practice. So whenever I first got involved in Critical Voice, I was a youth worker. I wasn't involved on the inside as such, and I went to a few writing days and really was trying to bring people together who had an interest for writing and research, and trying to say something about our practice, because the idea, I'm sure maybe the English and Welsh context is the same. Trying to get research that is published and trying to say something at that higher level is too far away from grassroots practice, yet there is so much work going on that has something to say into that space, that there needed to be a space for that to happen. So Youth Action had developed what was called the Critical Research Hub, which effectively was a series of events which brought in experts who were presenting research to a bunch of youth workers. And then alongside that, then the Critical Voice became the writing side of that. We have a steering group or advisory group with an editorial team that are made up of partners between ourselves and the sector, again run by Ulster and Youth Action, and trying to again raise a bank of writing research. It's quite anecdotal research in a lot of ways. It's not in terms of any academic rigor, but it's trying to use what's going on in terms of grassroots practice to speak into that public space. So we try to encourage our students as they're writing their dissertations, for example, to think about if this is of good quality and say something really interesting, this could be a space where that could be helpful for the sector. And we have, a number of colleagues across, statutory bodies and community voluntary bodies speaking into that space. So it's an online site. When we send you the links, you have that for your show notes, whatever. But it's a really great site in terms of, we particularly would signpost students to that, who use that then for helping develop a bit of reading skill and trying to understand what's out there. And what it does particularly well, I suppose, is brings a range of themes, cross-cutting themes, some of those specialisms you're talking about. Whilst we don't teach some of those specialisms on the course, as Lauren said, like once you graduate, we lay the foundations. Once you graduate and go out, you find lots of different things you're interested in. And what the Critical Voice site does really well is that it brings through some of those strong themes that people have a passion about. So, for example, if somebody was raising a particular issue around, mental health or something like that, and there was other colleagues in the sector wanted to get pulled together, what would happen is you would pull together as a writing group, develop some ideas, and then try to write something together would really be the way that would happen. And then it comes through a few processes, but it's a great resource. It's really, as you said, it's a bit different, I suppose. We would liken it a wee bit to the likes of Youth and Policy journal, which is it's obviously academic, but it's a bit like that in some senses, but in terms of the practice and applied nature. And then the likes of In Defence of Youth Work campaign, which is an English context. Again, it's just trying to say something on behalf of those who are really busy doing the work but want to be able to say something about their practice that feeds into a bigger conversation, So that was a bit of a long-winded explanation.
No, I think it sums up brilliantly. Because I think that writing process is, it is inherently, or I think it is. Yeah, I think it can avoid being it. It is a reflective process in itself. And I think particularly where it's an opportunity to download something, that thing that you've learned or that new issue that you've become aware of. And I remember somebody coming to me a few years ago, and they sort of said, look, we've got a real issue with what we think is a very nascent kind of gang culture in a part of Cardiff. And where do I start? And Wales doesn't have that really to any great extent, certainly in any way some of the bigger English cities. And of course what we didn't have, because it was a Welsh programme only operating in Wales, what we didn't have was peers within that context available to us to go and learn from. So immediately we had to kind of broaden our horizons, and you used that phrase a bit earlier, to go and say, okay, we've got to go to Bristol. Now Bristol's not that far, but that policy sense, because of, to a certain extent, a reflection of devolution and how maybe those borders have become a little bit harder, a bit firmer, Bristol feels a long way away in that policy sense. That was an interesting experience for me, because I began to think, actually, we as programmes need to connect across the 4 nations, 5 nations. I was involved with a piece of work that involved the Republic of Ireland as well. And actually, if we lack that, I think there is a danger we begin to close off avenues for learning from each other, which I think is always a bad thing. But it can't just stay at that level as well. And I think that's what the site does really, really well, is it just gives people that platform, that opportunity to get something down. And it sets, since you first sent me the link, it set the cogs turning in my head about a couple of things that maybe we can do. Again, in the age-old kind of adage of community work, you don't wait for it to be done to you. Just crack on and do it yourselves, organise yourselves and do it. And maybe there's some sort of site that we can put together. But I sense there's similar motives behind that site as to behind this podcast with me as well. So if people want to keep in touch with you, Mark and Lauren and others involved in the department and the studies, what's the best channels and platforms?
Yeah, I suppose for the institution, we're not too bad in terms of Twitter activity. So we're at Ulster Uni. I think it's Ulster Uni CYW, but if you just look for Ulster University Community Youth Work, we have an active Twitter feed, and you'll hear updates in terms of research and kind of bits and pieces we're pumping out. And that's also a good place to link, I suppose, to the Critical Voice website as well. So it's Critical Voice Northern Ireland is the website, and the Twitter handle is Critical Voice NI, which would be a good place for people again to pick up some of the writing we've done. I suppose the only other thing I suppose I would say in terms of our own context, if people were interested in hearing more, there's a series of books called Investing in Lives that one of our former colleagues, Professor Sam McCready, as a first version, which has been out for a number of years, and I don't even know the year of it now, but he just has a second book about to be released. Again, we tend to find lots of our go-to policy documents and reading and history is an English-based version, and we translate that, whereas what Sam and Richard Loudon, who used to work here, have done is track that history in our own environment, which is really interesting and really feeds into our course. So the second Invest in Life 2 is coming out on the 14th of February, and people can get a hold of that. But it's a really good place just to pick up some of the particulars about our Northern Irish context, given some of the troubles and the religious backdrop to what we're dealing with as well. But they're certainly the best place to contact. And then the team ourselves, we're on Twitter as well. But I think going through that Ulster Uni site will eventually bring you to the various parts of the team. And again, each of us have our own specialisms in terms of research and writing interests, as opposed to if anybody have a particular interest. There's a variety of specialisms within the team to pick out if somebody's interested.
Yeah, cool. Well, like I said, Lauren, best of luck with the studies, best of luck with the dissertation. Don't envy you. Best of luck with whatever comes after that. Let's keep in touch. I know we've discussed maybe kind of drilling down a little bit more into youth work as a topic, looking at different aspects. So certainly there's been some fantastic work I've only really glanced at, I'll concede, around the role of people in the peace process and peace building, which I think is potentially really, really rich to discuss in a bit more detail. Put me in touch with a couple of those colleagues on the McGee campus, I think, talking about communities and trauma and adversity, not just the impact of it, but how you can respond to it, and how actually sometimes it can, though one would not want to go through those processes again, it can have a sort of galvanizing effect and can have positive silver linings, as it were, to some of those clouds. So that's going to be good with your colleague Breeder, Mark. So yeah, and I'd like to catch up with Johnny again at some point and see where he's at, because I think, am I right in thinking that Stormont they're all playing with each other again? They've got their ball back?
They're all talking, we're back in action, yeah. So that's as of a couple of 40 maybe. Yeah, so things are back up and running. So obviously, maybe Johnny's podcast did something there. Somebody was listening. So,
well,
yeah, we're back in action. So
I'm not going to claim it didn't. Put it that way. But yeah, and it'd be interesting maybe to see if that context, those happenings, those processes, whether they do sort of filter through and translate in Johnny's case, updated sort of community strategies and other things related to the policy and certainly the funding aspect of things, because he said things that they've just kind of rolled forward year on year without any kind of real kind of interrogation of, okay, well, what do we want to do now? What is there a new phase you need to enter? It's just sort of happened, and it didn't strike me as a particularly healthy thing. But I'm not going to claim to be an expert on the politics. But if there's no alternative, then I guess it's the best of a bad bunch, I suppose.
100%. I think, and obviously you know yourself, whether that's the Northern Irish streakiness or whether it's the community voluntary the youth work streakiness, is you make do with what you have rather than actually sitting back and thinking, okay, let's think about this more. And I suppose that's maybe to our own detriment at times. You kind of just hammer on and you make the best of, you say, the bad situation, which is what's been happening. But hopefully things start to push forward and things change. Stay in business.
Yeah. Crossing lots of fingers and toes. Okay, well, I hope that works out. And let's keep in touch. I'm really grateful. Thank you for your time, both. Cheers.
Cheers, Wilson. Thanks.